On 31st December 1965, just 4.5 years after Sierra Leone gained independence from Britain and just a year into his tenure as Prime Minister, Sir Albert Magai signed into law the Public Order Act, Part 5 of which criminalizes libel and sedition. This is a law that has defined the media of Sierra Leone and guaranteed press freedom for 55 years until the Parliament of Sierra Leone expunged it from the law books of Sierra Leone on July 23, 2020, in a rather colorful occasion. This is an independent media commission documentary exploring the history and impact of the criminal libel law and the impact of its eventual repeal on the media landscape in Sierra Leone. It is an initiative by the commission to initiate frank dialogue with experts in the media to chart the way forward for a vibrant media in Sierra Leone. But why was the criminal libel law ever put into law by Sir Albert Magai in the first place?
He wanted to change the political system from multi-party to a one-party system, and he was getting a lot of opposition. And at the forefront of the opposition were journalists. They were giving him a hard time in putting forward his message. So we believe part of the reason why he came with this law was to be able to handle the journalists, to be able to stifle them so that they would not continue to disturb his program of imposing a one party. And true to speak, one of the first victims as soon as they enacted that law was a journalist. He was Dr. Sam Hollis was one of the first people who was held under that law, and it shows that that law was directly promulgated to stifle journalists.
In 1965, one would say we had then, because we had gained independence in 1961, Sir Magai was at the helm, up to that moment. We also had his brother Albert, who was also at the helm. Like I said, these were people who defied, I would say, all protocols when it came to their security. So for them, being at the helm of affairs was so paramount that dissenting views were not encouraged. Because it was in about 1971 also that people like Shaka Stevens came to the fore. But then we had Albert also, and there was these internal uprisings, if you like, politically, and they wanted to control the press then.
When it was being promulgated in 1965, because clearly it was aimed at their own journalist. Dr. Sam Hollis, who was editing Leone newspaper, was exposing the corrupt tendencies of the then Prime Minister Albert Magai. So this law was passed to clearly muzzle him and the Leone press. So you'd think that with the APC coming into power just a few years after the law, they would repeal it. For 24 odd years, they refused to repeal it.
While originally designed as Sir Albert Magai's tool to muzzle his political opponent, the criminal libel law was no doubt proved to be more inimical to the press than any other sector in society with legal implications.
In fact, the history is very interesting because, as a matter of fact, it was about not only about journalists but even about people that were critical of the system then. So, for example, what we now call civil society organizations, if they were called in that kind of manner, would have also labeled the law to have also targeted them. Because political opponents, people that were opposed to the then rule of Albert Magai, and others within the political system. So, in short, people have described the criminal libel law as a law that was actually meant to target specific people to ensure that they were silent. In other words, the critical voices against the political system at that time.
Technically, I would say yes. But when you look at the letters of the law, you wouldn't find that actually that it was more or less to target journalists, because journalists are not essentially named in the letters of the law. They only say any person who publishes any defamatory matter, as the case may be. So, but then journalists were those mostly seen to write critical things, or to say critical things about government. So, and it became a target for them practically.
One way, he had wanted to quiet dissenting voices and his critics and whatever was to push for a law like this, which eventually, of course, was enacted and became the criminal libel law. He had lots of opposition because the APC party by then was in opposition and he was leading the SLPP. So definitely the APC was against it, and even within the SLPP, some of his members of the party and parliamentarians were also not in favor of it. But there seemed to be a problem with Sierra Leone right from those early days, the way presidents tend to influence parliament.
But how much has the criminal libel law impacted the growth of the media in Sierra Leone?
It has a dampening effect. It does not allow people to come in and invest. And if people don't invest, the journalists would continue to be paid low wages. And if they continue to be paid low wages, they will see those in authority as standing between them and their plate of rice. And if you stand between them and their plate of rice, definitely your reputation will definitely be attacked. You see, so that is why we've been talking to them, and now a good number of them are seeing what we've been saying, and they agree with us. That is why I say by now we have a smaller number of people still yet to be to convince.
The experience in the past has made people not very willing to invest in the media. That is one. Two, even in terms of the practice itself, quite a number of journalists are afraid because the threat of being imprisoned is hanging over their heads. That would, for me, would be the key things.
The law seems to be covering us from going in depth into critical issues and trying to hold public officials to account. And because whenever it is mostly used by the politicians to intimidate the journalists so that they won't pursue some of their in-depth or critical reporting or investigative reporting on their activities. So it's generally a bad law.
What were the implications of the criminal libel law on Sierra Leone's democratic international ratings in the world?
The laws are different as you go across, other places in Africa. In some countries, like in Zimbabwe, for example, the courts annulled it. And in other countries, you have laws which would say that the journalist is not supposed to abuse the president. And these are the laws that you see now. Like very recently in Tanzania, a journalist is being held on accusation that he abused the president. And in mostly the French West African countries, the Francophone countries, you have that kind of law which protects the president from being written or spoken about in a manner which would be tantamount to abuse or in the eyes of the law. But we don't have those abuse laws in many of the English West African countries.
It has been repealed in some African countries. Some of them still have it in their law books, no doubt. But I think closer to us, I think Ghana is one of the countries that have been able to repeal it. And so definitely we can make reference to that. And Ghana has been able to do it. But there are some other countries, and then few countries in Kenya and some other East African countries, they've also been able to repeal it. But then it's still in some law books. But definitely we know, like I said earlier, it does not sit well with democracy.
The The criminal libel law has no doubt had its own fair share of victims and frontliners. Journalists whose commitment to the search for truth was undaunted and unruffled. When all forms of political oppositions had died in this country that had long espoused the one-party system, only the press held the government to account. Even in democratic dispensations, the war with the press has continued unabated.
One of the major cases had to do with Julius Spencer, the New Breed newspaper, when they were brought in on the same issues around seditious libel laws. That's one clear example. Now, aside Philip Neville, Paul Kamara, in fact, he suffered both civil as well as criminal. Okay? Philip Neville, David Tambayo, Jonathan Lee. Okay? And let us don't go too far. Quite recently, 5 of our colleagues were arraigned in court because of criminal libel laws. Now, I think the point you are trying to arrive at is we don't have many concluded cases on criminal libel laws lawsuits. That is in fact the problem. What will happen? Most often than not, journalists are arrested on Friday. They spend the night at Pademba Road prisons. On Monday morning, they are given bail, and then the association and some other elders will go to the people. They will plead with them, and then that will be the end of the matter. So, in terms of the decided cases, there are few of them, but they are not many, because those cases, most of them, there were no logical conclusions to those cases before the court of law. But that is not to say that they do not exist.
Since I started in 83, 84 under Shaki, ultimately I confronted all the different regimes, and I paid the price for it. But I remember, I think around about late 80s, you know, at that time, you know, I've been to jail here and there, you know, from Shaka Stevens, from various other regimes, to Tijan Kaba, SLPP, which I was jailed 6 months, and then my entire property was seized, you know. And then I was jailed 4 years again. I spent 30 months in solitary confinement.
I've been to prison. The first newspaper that I edited was the New Breed newspaper, and I fell foul of the military regime at the time. Ended up at Pademba Road prison, charged with sedition and criminal libel, etc., etc. In and out of Pademba Road a couple of times. Eventually found guilty, but we were given the option of a fine, so paid the fine. Gave notice of appeal, and this was in 1993. That appeal hasn't even come up for hearing up till today.
My first experience has to do with a matter that was brought against us by a human rights lawyer in the name of lawyer Pamomo Fofana about seditious libel and defamation. We were incarcerated and put behind bars for about 4 to 5 days. But at the end of the day, the matter was thrown out of court. But the recent matter, which happens to be the one that has to do with the chief minister, for which, as a media practitioner, all I did was to seek clarification of an investigation that was ongoing. And I was manhandled. I was put behind bars just for seeking clarification. And as I speak, my phones are still at the CID. They've not been given, my phone have not been given to me back, and the matter has not been charged to court.
A victim of that as well. I wrote a story. Ironically, it's about Sylvia Blinding, and it was like asking President, because she was doing a lot of things out of the way. We were asking President Nkrumah to tame his shrew. That was the headline. President Nkrumah, tame your shrew, you know. And the next thing we knew, we were invited to the CID. We were invited to the CID, myself, the proprietor of the paper, my editor, 3 of us were there. I mean, we spent 7 hours at the CID being questioned over what at the end of the day, I didn't even know why we were there.
A lot of institutions and personalities have actively played their part in the fight against the criminal libel law. The Sierra Leone Association of Journalists, in partnership with media organizations, donor agencies and frontline journalists, have worked doggedly over the years to repeal this obnoxious law in Sierra Leone.
It was a very long fight, and my impression and information is that in fact SLAJ was founded either implicitly or even clearly to ensure that this law ceased existing. Campaigning took all different formats. Some of it was bellicose, some of it was activist, some of it was diplomatic, you know, to the extent some of it was even you know, legal, so to speak, because there was even a litigation, in which case SLAJ went to the Supreme Court, sitting as a country's constitutional court, to interpret the fact that we have Part 3 of our Constitution, which guarantees free speech, and then we had this law which predated the country's constitution, which basically criminalized free speech. And then the Supreme Court wouldn't give a ruling based on the merits, but rather they said that SLAJ did not have the local standard to have gone to court on the matter. Incensing us, you know, wanted to do a peaceful protest, the police wouldn't allow us. It was sometimes really very vexatious.
The era of Honorable Ibrahim Kabu as president of SLAJ. By then he was the editor and publisher of Initiative newspaper, Tulumbu. He also made it a priority, one of his priority, to repeal the law, and I remember that he actually started engaging the government in that regard, but unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he was appointed Minister of Information. Then he abandoned the engagement to get government to repeal the law. And then after that, we also have Umar Fofana, who is also on record of taking the issue to court to get the Supreme Court to expunge the law from the law books. But the court threw the case out, saying Umar Fofana, as president of SLAJ, lacked the locus to pursue for the expunge of the law. And then the most recent one is Kelvin Hughes as president in the last six years has been engaging the government in this regard to also get the criminal level law repealed. So these are some of the instances. And I also remember that there have also been some publications in terms of getting the law repealed, why the law should be repealed. I remember Pamumo Fofana, a lawyer also is Esquire. He has written many articles condemning the law and calling for its repeal. I also know that Melron Nicole Wilson, who was the head of LOCLA at the time, also, I think he published a book. LOCLA published a book on the criminal libel law, and why it should be repealed, calling on highlighting the negative aspect of the law and why it should be repealed in order to ensure that the media developed.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission that ushered in peace, progress and development in Sierra Leone, in its recommendation, in fact, in one of the imperative recommendations of the TRC said criminal libel laws are not good for any democratic society, and the TRC recommended the repeal of those laws. That was way back in 2004. We still continue to hold on to a law that adds no value to this country.
But attempts at repealing the criminal libel law have not been peculiar to Sierra Leone in the sub-region. There have equally been stories of successes and failure with the repeal of the criminal libel law that some countries even agitated a return to the law.
Interestingly, one of the reasons that made me really ashamed of being a Sierra Leonean and that this law was in our law books was the fact that, believe it or not, 10 countries in West Africa had repealed this law, including Guinea and Liberia. All 10 of 16 countries had done away with this law. And the question was, we were doing relatively better in terms of frequent elections and some semblance of democracy than some of those other West African countries. Yet we still had it in our law books. So it has worked pretty well in the case of Ghana, really well. It has opened the Ghanaian media landscape. It has brought about a lot of accountability, journalism being done by the media in that country of Ghana. But I wouldn't say the same for Guinea, where it's no longer in the law books, but free speech is still being suffocated in Guinea. But it's been phenomenal in Ghana in terms of how far the media landscape has developed and how far they've been able to hold their leaders accountable.
I've seen 1 or 2 countries that attempted to remove a similar legislation. But again, it was the same practitioners who went to the government of that country and said, oh no, the courts are killing us. Because if you do not have a regulatory authority that is strong enough, then the courts will perform the regulatory duties that are so necessary in any given civilized society. So they begin to fine journalists sums that they cannot afford, to the extent that they lose their newspaper houses, right, confiscated by the state. So you will discover that it may not be the best way, but of course, let us look at it from this angle. Again, it is part of the liberalization of the democratic practice in any given country.
The past regime of President Koma made some attempts and pronouncements about the repeal and aided in the consultation, but felt short of repealing it for fear of the backlash of journalists who might not handle it in a very mature and responsible way.
And one of the things I realized was the fact that the APC was in opposition then. They condemned it, and of course their position was that it is not good, and you're expecting when they assume power they will change it. But unfortunately the APC condemned the SLPP for it. After the SLPP lost power and the APC took over power, I think in 1968, thereabouts, they did not change it. It was still enforced. After that, we've had several changes of government back and forth. They will make commitments when they're in opposition, but no sooner they assume power, bam, they forget about it, they enjoy it.
But the Bill regime, from its political manifesto, has shown a remarkable commitment to the cause of repealing the criminal libel law. In a series of calculated moves, the Bill regime made frantic efforts to translate a manifesto promise into reality in a series of presidential pronouncements and commitments, both at national and international quarters. At the first state opening of Parliament in his tenure as president, President Bill made a commitment to repeal the criminal libel law. At the United Nations General Assembly in 2018, President Bill made a commitment to repeal the criminal libel law. At 2 presidential cocktails with the press in 2018 and 2019, President Bill reiterated his commitment to repeal the criminal libel law.
We are fully committed to promoting a free press, rescinding adversarial public order laws, and protecting and promoting the rights of citizens to know and to access information. We have instituted a National Civic Education Commission to further ensure the unrestricted participation of every Sierra Leonean in our stable democracy. For all of the foregoing, we need a constructive but intensive and sustained engagement with our bilateral partners and partner institutions.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, on occasions like this, while the humor brings smiles to our faces, we must also not forget to reflect on how far we have come as partners, strange partners, government and the media, or the Sierra Leone Association of Journalists, to ensure that our democracy succeeds. To start with, my campaign promise to repeal Part 5 of the criminal libel law has transcended from what used to be a dream to almost reality. And I understand from the Minister of Information and Communication, it will be tabled in Parliament before the end of this year.
But it took the leadership, commitment and tenacity of the Minister of Information, Mohamed Rahman Soare, and team to see through a process that had a windy path of first being agreed by the Sierra Leone cabinet, then gazetted and sent to Parliament, where the period was allowed to elapse and an other tabling had to take place, making many in the oppositions to surmise that perhaps there was not enough commitment, even within the ruling SLPP government, to drive home the repeal.
My passion for a free media did not start today, but my current passion is a mirror reflection of His Excellency President Bill's commitment to midwife and unfettered and free the media. So that is why you see me this committed. I mean, it is instructive to note that in its history from 1965, this is the only government that has been bold, courageous and audacious enough to pass it through cabinet, and today it's in Parliament. Just last week, the Deputy Minister, Madam Gobe, and I were in conversation with the leadership of Parliament, and they have firmly committed to make it one of the bills they will look at immediately when Parliament reopens after His Excellency President Bill's state opening of Parliament address on the 28th. So it's very much on the radar. It's for us a thing we have to do, because the President believes that the media has an important role to play in our democracy, and therefore he does not want practitioners to be criminalized for merely doing their job.
Let me also advise the minister that he should try to win his own people to his side, because marking the 1965 Public Order Act or the removal of Part 5 is quite contentious. There are some people of the SLPP who simply believe that by removing that, they will open a Pandora's box against their party. So you want to be very certain that that is not the case. When I was minister under the APC, I had opposition from my own members. They said, look, you are a journalist, we don't want you to play to the gallery. We are not too comfortable with this thing. But of course, this is the same thinking within the SLPP camp. Mr. Minister would want to be very, very certain that everybody in his own party, within their own ranks, is with him. If it's not with him, it will not work. Right? It will come here, mark you. When it came here the last time, it was listed down after the first reading. All that was needed was to bring it now for the second and final reading. And who should have done that? The leader of government business. That is his authority. And which party does he belong to? The SLPP. So it could have been so easy. And I've not heard anybody from the APC who actually said we are not going to debate it or take the position of the government on board. Nobody opposed it. But the fact of the matter is we allowed it to lapse.
No, we did not withdraw the document. It was due to parliamentary proceedings. Section 15, SO 59 of the standing orders tells us that if you have a bill that lapses for over 3 months or a session is finished, you have to review it again. Otherwise, you have to have a consensus in the chamber for you to look at the document again. That doesn't mean we have just thrown it away. No, we are only basically observing the procedures in Parliament. The bill will come again because, I mean, from that time to now, it has lapsed over 4 or 5 months. You agree with me? So if you don't mind, you can look at the standing order. That's why I deliberately read the provisions in the standing orders. So we are going to start all over again. The minister will come and start with the normal process to have a bill in Parliament, to be gazetted, and it will come to in Parliament for debate to do the first reading, second reading, and third reading passing to law.
While attempts were being made to repeal the criminal libel law, there were many concerns that there were no existing safeguards should journalists choose to abuse their newfound freedom. What came as an institutional safeguard was to strengthen the Independent Media Commission to effectively regulate the media in a situation where there were abuses. This was what brought about the gazetting of the Independent Media Act 2020 that attracted a lot of criticisms that the Independent Media Commission was being given too many powers.
The IMC is already empowered. The current IMC Act is strong enough to regulate the media. I mean, what difference will this make if not to add more burden or give the commission some kind of sweeping powers to actually suppress or gag the press?
It took some consultation with the Sierra Leone Association of Journalists and other stakeholders in the media to eventually find a point of convergence. On July 23rd, 2020, at a very colorful occasion in Parliament, the criminal libel law was expunged from the law books of Sierra Leone and a new IMC Act 2020 came into existence. It was by all means a momentous occasion which saw all parties unanimously collaborate to repeal an obnoxious law that had gauged press freedom in Sierra Leone for decades.
I'm very excited to the extent that on the day Parliament voted to repeal it, I shed tears of joy. It had been a very long, drawn-out battle, lasting almost 50 years. So when it happened on that day, I was completely overwhelmed. I think it's one of the brightest days in our recent history that this very obnoxious law, which basically criminalized free speech, is no longer in our statutes. I'm really very excited it is. And I feel it'll completely change the media landscape in Sierra Leone in the sense that those private sector investors who, because of the repressive nature of this law, wouldn't want to invest in the media industry would now invest in it because they don't stand the risk of being picked up and locked up simply because of the contents of a newspaper. Because under the old law, even the printing press owner would be held liable. So would the newspaper vendor. So I believe that with that law gone, there will be more investment in the media industry now.
This is a victory for all Sierra Leoneans that our nation is promoting free press and responsible journalism. Special thanks to the President, Dr. Julius Maada Bio, for making the promise and living up to it. Special thanks to the past regime of President Ernest Bai Koroma for keeping the hopes alive. Special thanks to all the journalists who paid the price for this momentous day all through these years. Special thanks to the Minister of Information and Communication, Mohamed Rahman Soare, and team for piloting the final phases of the repeal and for the courage and tenacity they have shown. Thanks to the many donor partners for the support they gave through all these phases. Thanks to all media bodies in the country, especially to the Sierra Leone Association of Journalists and associate bodies, and all who in one way or the other played a part in this victory. This is land that we love, our Sierra Leone.